Welcome to the Lead Well podcast. Around here, we believe leadership shouldn't cost you your peace, your well-being, or the parts of yourself that you have worked so hard to reclaim. I'm your host, Trasetta Washington, leadership wellness coach and strategist, and my mission is to give you practical, actionable steps to help you reduce overwhelm, lead more effectively, and build a sustainable rhythm for both your team and your life. Let's dive into today's conversation. Hey leaders, welcome back to the Lead Well podcast. Today I want to talk about team well-being, but specifically the kind of fatigue that doesn't always seem to make sense on paper. It's the kind where if you look at the workloads or you look at the output, everything seems to be normal. There's no major increases, no obvious overload, but yet your team feels tired, slower, maybe even a little less patient. They could be less engaged. A lot of leaders get stuck here because they're looking at the data. They're looking at the information and they're thinking, I don't understand why everyone seems so worn down. Nothing has really changed. But here's the thing, something has changed. It's just not always as visible as you would like it to be. What I see over and over again is that team fatigue is often invisible before it becomes undeniable. It's not just about how much work people are doing. It's about how much they're carrying that no one is counting. No one sees it. One of the biggest contributors to this is mental load, right? This is the kind of workload where no one writes it down on a task list, and no one's really assigning it. It's that holding the context in your head, keeping track of all of the different priorities that keep shifting. It's remembering who needs what when, anticipating problems before they happen so things don't fall apart. I see this a lot in high-functioning teams, especially in nonprofits, higher ed, and other mission-driven organizations where people genuinely care and don't want to be the reason that something doesn't get done. So instead of going and asking for clarity, they compensate, or I should say overcompensate. They keep track of more. They fill in the gaps. And that constant mental load or cognitive load is exhausting, even if the actual task list itself hasn't grown. Another layer that often gets overlooked is what I'd call organizational trauma, right? It is this emotional residue after something traumatic happens or some sort of crisis hits the organization, right? Teams don't reset just because the crisis is over. Layoffs, turnover in leadership, a lot of change in rapid succession, understaffing, or even just prolonged uncertainty, all of those things leave an imprint. I've worked with teams where things were technically better than they were a year ago, but the team members, the people themselves, their nervous systems had not yet caught up. People were still kind of bracing for impact. They were still waiting for the next disruption, for the other shoe to drop, so to speak. And leaders can sometimes miss this because everyone's still functioning. Alongside that, there are these invisible expectations and unspoken responsibilities that are just kind of floating around. There's this work that isn't formally assigned, but somehow, some way, it always seems to get done. There is emotional labor, relationship management, being the individual, the person who smooths things over or tries to help keep the morale up. None of that shows up on a workload report. None of that shows up on a task list. But it takes real energy to manage all of that. And then there is the culture. Many teams operate in cultures where that pushing through is praised, where they celebrate resilience without there always be, there's not necessarily the support that is needed, or a culture where it feels unsafe or risky to pull back or to slow down a little bit. And so people learn really quickly what is rewarded in an organization and what is ignored. So they just keep going. They ignore the signs and the signals. And what ends up happening is strain becomes normal until they just can't. They can't anymore. Unclear priorities also play a bigger role here than I think leaders sometimes realize. When everything feels urgent, your team spends a lot of energy trying to decide what it is that matters most. So they end up second guessing decisions, or they redo work. They may even worry about there being misalignment or being out of alignment with the goals and objectives of their team or the organization as a whole. And that constant uncertainty is emotionally draining, even if the volume of work hasn't increased. Now, something else I want you to consider is the connection between your energy and your team's energy. I say this all the time. Your team mirrors your leadership, and they mirror your leadership more than they mirror strategy. If you're exhausted, rushed, or constantly in reaction mode, they pick up that pace. On the contrary, if you're calm, clear, and grounded, they pick that up too. I have seen teams shift dramatically just because their leader, their manager slowed down enough to reset expectations and model what it looks like to be steady, to be grounded. Some of the signs that your team well-being is declining aren't very obvious. They're not dramatic. They may look like an increase in irritability, or your team members aren't as creative as they once were. You might even see people doing the bare minimum instead of bringing forward ideas and problem solving and innovating. You'll see more mistakes, more underlying tension in people's conversations, or even people just pulling back. They're no longer engaged. And it's not because they don't care, but it's because they're trying to conserve their energy. The natural instinct in these type of moments is to add something, right? Some sort of new initiative, a new wellness offering, another meeting. But addressing team fatigue doesn't usually require more. What it actually requires is removing the friction. So clarifying priorities instead of stacking one upon another. Taking a look at your processes to remove any unnecessary steps. Identifying where the strain is instead of ignoring it and pretending like it doesn't even exist. I promise you, these really small shifts can make a huge difference. And you as the leader can support well-being by being very explicit about what it is that matters the most right now. You can support well-being by creating space for recovery after you've had really intense periods. One of the things that I used to do before I stepped into full-time entrepreneurship, I worked for a university, and we had for an outreach program, and we had a summer camp. And it was very labor intensive. We did 3 different sessions that were a week long, and it was a residential camp. So that meant that our small staff had to take turns staying on campus in the dorms with the students. We had very early days. We would start our days at 7 and we wouldn't end till 10, 11 o'clock at night. So it was a lot of work. We do 1 week on, 2 weeks off, 1 week on, 1 week off, and then the last week of the session. And by the end of that last session, we were all exhausted. And so I would give my team members extra days off in between each session, and they got a full week off after the last session. We just had to kind of stagger it so that there was coverage in the office. But I gave them room, I gave them space for them to recover because I knew how intense that work was. And we needed that mental and physical reset to be able to get back to where we could operate before the school year would start back up, right? Another way that you could support the well-being of your team is by acknowledging that they've been carrying a lot, even if they've been doing it well. This matters more than we oftentimes admit, because well-being is deeply tied to retention and morale. People don't usually leave because they had one hard week. No, they leave because the environment or the culture feels chronically unclear, unsustainable, and just heavy. People stay where they feel seen, supported, and steady, not just productive. And this is why team well-being really has to be intentional. It doesn't improve by accident. You as a leader are the one that has to shape the conditions that your team operates within. Supporting the well-being of your team members isn't optional. I'm going to say that again. Supporting the well-being of your team is not optional. It is a part of your responsibility as a leader. Now, this is where my teamwork tune-up fits in so naturally, because the tune-up looks at trust, communication, collaboration, performance, and well-being all together instead of treating well-being as some sort of add-on or a personal responsibility. It helps you and your team identify what it is that's happening beneath the surface so that you can reduce any unnecessary strain and rebuild ways of working that are actually sustainable. Now, if you're listening to this and you're realizing that your team feels tired, even though the workloads they have kind of seem normal, or that there is this heaviness that you can't quite pinpoint or you can't quite explain, I would love to support you. You can learn more about the Teamwork Tune-Up and explore how you can bring me in to work with your team using the link that's inside of the show notes. It's one of the most effective ways that I've found to strengthen team health from the inside out before that fatigue they're experiencing turns into burnout or disengagement. And as you move through the rest of your week, I want to invite you to pay attention to what your team is carrying that maybe no one is talking about yet. Sometimes identifying it, sometimes just giving it a voice is the first step towards lightening that load. That's all I have for you today. Until